answer, I need y'all to write down what you think New Historicism has to do with
Or like what
what it is. What do
what
you think it
the
is?
content
How it relates to a book. Doesn't have to be something.
Just like from the name, what do you think it might
What do you
might
think it
possibly
means to you, Taylor?
You said new historicism?
be? New historicism.
Oh, you can't see it.
Why is it like that? Here.
Right there.
Okay.
Right there.
I know. I'm doing this.
Okay, y'all done?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna ask y'all the same question after and see if y'all's answer changes. Okay.
Probably would.
Should I just not do it on full screen if it's not gonna give it all?
No, if you click it, it'll do it. If it'll fix itself.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we'll press allow.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can.
Okay.
Alright, so this is just like an introduction to New Historicism. It's like how it was, how it came about with Stephen Greenblatt in the 1980s. And just,
He came up with this theory based on a book from, I think it was Foucault, and it's basically that any piece of literature has so much to do with history, like the background of it, the time and place of when the author wrote it, and when the book is set in, and how his beliefs and his thoughts and the culture and environment all influence that one book and that all piece of literature, and it has to do with every single book, everywhere, anywhere.
Like how the characters may act, like their beliefs, and just like the interactions between people and their relationships.
Can we go back a second?
We basically summarized.
Okay.
Okay. So this is also what I said. So if the author is writing in his present time, then critics will look at how the time he is living in right now influenced that piece of literature, like what they think, what they're saying, the slang, how that all interprets it. And if he's writing in the past, they'll look at how accurately he got that right, how accurately the history was compared to real life in the book. And they'll also look at the time of the author and his beliefs. Bless you. Okay, this is a video, I think it's from Yale.
yeah, it's a Yale professor.
It's only 6 minutes.
Yeah, the first 6 minutes are.
He even references Huck Finn, so good video.
The other video. Okay, is the audio on?
Make sure your
So,
volume is
Today we turn to a mode of doing literary criticism which was extraordinarily widespread beginning in the late 70s and into the 80s, called the New Historicism. It was definable in ways that I'll turn to in a minute, and as I say, prevalent to a remarkable degree everywhere. It began probably at the University of California at Berkeley, under the auspices in part of Stephen Greenblatt, whose brief essay you've read for today. Greenblatt and others founded a journal, still one of the most important and influential journals in the field of literary study, called Representations. Always has been, still is, an organ for new historicist thought. It's a movement which began primarily preoccupied with the early modern period, the so-called Renaissance. The New Historicism is in effect responsible for the replacement of the term Renaissance with the term early modern. And its influence, however, quickly did extend to other fields. Some fields perhaps more than others. It would be, I think, probably worth a lecture that I'm not going to give to explain why certain fields somehow or another seem to lend themselves more readily to new historicist approaches than others. And I think it's fair to say that in addition to the early modern period, the three fields that have been most influenced by the new historicism are the 18th century, British Romanticism, and Americanist studies from the late colonial through the Republican period, the emergence of print culture, the emergence of the public sphere as a medium of influence and the distribution of knowledge in the United States has been very fruitfully studied from the historicist points of view. So those are the fields that are most directly influenced by this approach. When we discuss Julianne's essay, you'll see how it influences romantic studies. Now, the new historicism was, and this probably accounts for its remarkable popularity and influence in the period roughly from the late 70s through the early 90s. The new historicism was a response to an increasing sense of ethical failure in the isolation of the text as it was allegedly practiced in certain forms of literary study, beginning with the new criticism, through the period of deconstruction, the recondite discourse of Lacan and others in psychoanalysis. There was a feeling, widespread among scholars, especially younger scholars, that somehow or another, especially in response to pressing concerns, sort of post-Vietnam, concerns with globalization, concerns with the distribution of power and global capital, all of these concerns inspired what one can only call a guilt complex in academic literary scholarship and led to a return to history. It was felt that a kind of ethical tipping point had been arrived at, and that the modes of analysis that had been flourishing needed to be superseded by modes of analysis in which history and the political implications of what one was doing became prominent and central. I have to say that in debates of this kind, there's always a considerable amount of hot air, perhaps on both sides. In many ways, it's not the case that the so-called isolated approaches really were isolated. Deconstruction in its second generation wrote
That's enough of that. And so this is just like how it connects with Huckleberry Finn. And since Mark Twain was trying to get the point across with racism and many other themes in Huck Finn. And we picked some scenes too.
Well, also because he based Huck Finn off of his childhood and his life, and that's really an important theme in New Historicism because that's what they look at, like how his life influenced the book, and it was a really big part in Huck Finn. Okay, let's go on with the further time for a poster.
The desk, so people in the back can see.
Don't forget about the video. You got it.
Hold on.
It's not gonna work.
Okay, I'm just gonna hold it then.
Here.
There we go. Okay, so we picked like 3 scenes from Huckleberry Finn to kind of demonstrate how New Historicism is played in the book. And one is superstition, and like the scene where Jim falls asleep and Huck puts his hat on the branch.
And he thinks it's like some ghost.
Yeah, something like that.
And superstition was really an important theme of that time, and so
popular.
that's how New Historicism comes to play in it, because it's looking back on that time, and it was a big deal.
And you can tell through some of his other stories how superstition plays a role in his other stories.
And then like society. how Huck and Tom are just completely different. Huck grew up with a father as a drunk, and Pap, as we talked about in other classes, like is the main key, like represents racism in the book, and how he just grew up. People thought he was trash. He was a bad influence. He was a delinquent, and even though he had Miss Watson's influence, it still didn't change like people's opinions about him or like his nature and how he acted. And then there's Tom, who grew up going to church, going to school, had like learned manners, learned from right and wrong, and still at the end of the book, even though he grew up like knowing like that slavery is okay and like being brought up and saying like that it's part of their culture, he even wanted to help Jim escape.
And that's where New Historicism comes in, because Mark Twain was taught when he was young, since he lived in Hannibal, where it was slavery was okay and they were treated better. So that's what Tom knew, that slavery was okay. But then they realized it wasn't. And that's what he was trying to get across the whole time.
And then, and obviously, like racism and slavery, how Jim is Miss Watson's like property, and how that's really how it was during the time that Mark Twain grew up, and when he was writing the book, and how people like thought of, and like how black people were portrayed back then, just property, and they weren't as good as they weren't people. Yeah. And it's just like it's really evident like how much influence racism has in the book, and how Mark Twain uses it to get across to the readers that racism is groundless and ignorant, and it should be questioned.
And he does question.
And he does question. And then questions.
I think we did.
And he uses like the sharp stick irony to show people that, and that's like the method that he kind of uses to like make people really like think about racism, and how ignorant it is, and how like the beliefs of it are groundless, and that there's no need for it. And then the effect is just that the people reading the book, even though it was banned many times, and even though it wasn't always banned for just racism, it was also banned for homosexual ideals, and
It just
also,
makes everyone think, and they get so uncomfortable, so they think about it more, and then it makes more sense.
it makes them,
That was the point.
he's like trying to make them understand.
Okay, why do you think historicism is an important concept in relation to literature?
Because like the history behind where the story, whatever story it is, takes place, is like how you need to analyze the characters and their relationships, and how to understand like what's really trying to be like said.
Okay, thinking back to How to Read Like a Professor. Yeah, related to that book.
Because it's like each author is going to have a different perspective of how they write and how they were grown up or how they were brought up, and just like their different backgrounds, it changes everything.
Do you think we as a society will ever accept this as a practice with literature?
No.
Or, you know, if you look at art, music, and we've had these discussions, but if you look at whatever it is you're looking at it through these eyes, how does it change the way we look at anything?
It shows how like influential like society is, and how the beliefs and how you're brought up is so influential in what you do and what you say and what you believe, and so it transpires into the author's works.
And then, so the last part is, the point of you writing the question at first was, so now you actually know what it is. And so at the bottom of your page, just write like,
What do you
maybe,
think it is?
yeah, like 2 sentences on like your different opinions now that you know what it is. Actually read it.
Do y'all have any questions? Or confused about anything?
I mean, it's a pretty simple concept.
I was confused at the beginning, but
It's very good.
It's a big word.
Okay, very good.